because we've had this sort of experienced so much defeat, crisis, and social regression, that sense of history is sort of been like lost and disintegrated. So in history is just seen as something that just happens to you, almost fatalistic, deterministic, and that our capacity to change how it goes, it's sort of been depreciated.
So is it that the idea of our liberal subject, is it the liberal subject as an idea that is dead, or is it really dead?
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
So why I wanted to talk to you is that you have written about the idea of Prometheus and how this relates to socialism. So could you give us kind of a background for anybody who maybe isn't familiar with the myth of Prometheus?
Prometheus was a Greek Titan god who rebelled against Zeus and the shall we say the divine establishment of Greece by giving the gift of fire to mankind. And obviously the myth of that shows that it's meant to sort of tell how mankind moved from being a prehistorical sort of mammal into being a historical being, because once you have fire, you can use nature to better your own self. That's like the start. Once you start fire, you can start building civilization, if you will. And Prometheus, for his sin of doing that, was chained onto a rock by Zeus and was picked apart by, all sorts of animals and birds for the rest of his days.
Doomed for his liver to be eaten every morning and regrow every evening.
Yeah. Why that myth is important for Marx, because it was actually his favorite Greek mythology. For a lot of Marxists, like, the proletariat is now in place of Prometheus, in the sense that it has all this potential to enact world historical change, yet at the same time he is enchained by capital. I think Clara Zetkin kind of made that sort of analogy, how the proletariat is enchained by capital, just like Prometheus was by the gods. Prometheus also kind of represents this sort of strive for freedom and creativity and industriousness and, big titanic projects for socialism. Not just for socialism, but you see even within bourgeois capitalism, they have that kind of Promethean ethic. One thing I do think is a bit sort of tragic is how the only people you see sort of defending this kind of Promethean vision is like right-wing libertarians or, the acolytes of Ayn Rand, this sense of sort of large-scale creativity and what humans are capable of. And I think it's kind of a bit tragic how within, the socialist left, that Promethean heritage is more or less dissipated or sort of scorned upon as some kind of relic of the Enlightenment that's, destroying our environment or whatever.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in that. So this idea of like the working class being like having stolen, or no, have been given fire, I suppose, or had fire and tried to sort of forge a way for humanity, and then they get chained to a rock is such a good metaphor for like the, the reaction that comes up after failed revolutionary attempts, that there's a period of repression afterward. And this is, obviously the experience after 1848, the experience after the 1930s, all of these times where humanity gets chained to a rock. Yeah. But I was wondering, why is it really a recent thing that we've lost this Promethean spirit, or were Marx and Engels alone in this always? Because it seems to me like we think like, oh, there used to be this really Promethean vision, but it was actually always quite confined. There were always utopian socialists against whom Marx was arguing, and there were very few kind of proper, in my opinion, sort of progressive people in socialism. It's always been the case. Or is this more of a recent thing, like a post-war thing, the horrors of the 20th century kind of laid this idea to rest?
I suppose it depends how you see it, because with Marx's critique of the utopian socialists, like you can say Saint-Simon was a bit more of a Promethean because he was a kind of big science guy, but except that he was more, I think, a technocrat as opposed to a kind of someone who had a more democratic sensibility. He, if you will, can be charged with this sort of productivist label or technocrat label. And, it is true that there were sort of socialists that Marx was arguing about, like Proudhon, who kind of railed against the Industrial Revolution because it was big scale, and sort of, took a very moralistic approach to it, whereas Marx and Engels saw like the potential that lay within this industrial capacity that capitalism has to improve or be used for the betterment of all humanity in a different context. So like technology that can be used, that is used now to just create surplus value or even be used as the master of human beings, can in a different context be used to the betterment of human beings, and human beings will be the masters of technology, not the other way around. And though I do think that within like the communist movement there was a more Promethean vision, because all of from Marx, Engels, Trotsky, Lenin, they had this idea that socialism, in Trotsky's word, would increase the power of man over nature and abolish the power of man over man. Whereas, if you will, the more eco-socialists more now sort of view like the power of man over man and the power of man over nature as more or less one and the same, that if you increase humanity's power over nature, that will lead to sort of exploitation and oppression of man. Yeah.
So two things there. If people don't know what technocracy is, how is this different from, people will wind up wanting to kind of go against this postmodern thrust of a lot of leftism that has a tendency to be sort of maybe anti-science a little bit, and then they go all in on science. You can see this now where people think that they're being based by like taking so-called obesity science for real because of like the whole fat acceptance movement. But that whole science is a bunch of bullshit. Like you can laugh at some of the absurdities of the culture war without reifying shit science. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what is the difference between technocracy and using technology for the betterment and the emancipation of human beings, and how can we avoid that slippage?
I would make this distinction like this, that technocracy is the more sort of very elitist idea that sort of reifies technology as well, that kind of wants to use sort of science, that kind of views society as this sort of mechanical sort of entity, and people are like cogs within this great entity, and they, the technocrats, are sort of the managers of it, and they will use sort of science, technology to sort of manage this sort of, to manage and contain people within it. So that would be the distinction I would rest on.
Okay. And then the other question is that, if you talk about these sorts of things online, you'll always get a ton of people coming at you, like quoting a letter of Marx from like 1881, talking about how if you've had this happen, I imagine.
I know what's being said. Yeah.
So, but no, Marx thought that Russia could avoid things, and you could surely that means he actually advocated for small scale bottom up. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, the Narodniks were proven wrong. Those communes were destroyed by capitalism. And if you read that Marx's letter, what it says was, if there was a proletarian revolution in the West, the core capitalist countries, then those Russian communes can skip the capitalist stage, if you will, and go straight to socialism, because the proletariat have the capitalist countries and they can gain the benefits of technology, modernity,
of course,
without capitalism. So
yeah. And it annoys me too, because people will quoting that letter at me while I'm quoting it back at them. So it's just like people just read each other's posts and they're like, oh, but Marx said this. Yeah. Clearly, he's saying it's not of necessity that you have to go through these stages. If you have another country that's already gone through them, you can get tech from them. You can go. There's no necessary way why you have to go through the evils of capitalism, as long as it's developed somewhere else.
Part of what's kind of annoying about that is it kind of implies we're having this debate as if we're in 1818 debating whether we should introduce capitalist relations into Africa when it's already happening. It's been like this since 1880. The world is more, if you will, capitalism and its combined and uneven development is more mature, if that's the right word, now than it was in 1880. We've had a whole era of globalization, of mass migration, of technological advances and all, and the shift in how capitalism forms itself. And for example, China is a core capitalist country today, as well as certain parts of East Asia. That wasn't true in 1880. Are we going to say that China doesn't need capitalist relations when it's already got them? So it's and also what underlines it is also this sort of dependency theory argument that really, capitalism may have been progressive in the West, but really in outside the West, really, which is basically a kind of euphemism for the global South, that, capitalist development isn't really progressive there because of imperialism, etc. When as well, the history of the Asian tigers and China kind of refutes that altogether. And it's, in other words, the dialectical development of capitalism is now a global process. It's like a universal thing. The idea that capitalism is some kind of Eurocentric idea, it wasn't even true in the 19th century. It's certainly not true now.
I think part of the impulse too is this desire not to give even a little. So I think a lot of people on the left just want to say capitalism is evil. And if there's any perception of like saying that a lot of what has happened here is good and can be built on and gives us the potential. For me, not for me, I just think it's a very basic aspect of Marxism that the future grows out of the present,
Communism can only be built upon the basis of capitalism itself. Capitalism is the bridge towards socialism.
Yeah. And they don't want to agree with that. And they think, well, if you say anything nice about capitalism, people won't be convinced. And then we'll never have a revolution. So you just have to convince people it's all bad, it's all bad, it's all bad. But also, I think that part of it is this death of a kind of, or speaks to this absence of a progressive vision. So it's like everything that happened is regrettable, which, you can regret some of the things that happened, certainly. And capitalism doesn't need to advance into every crevice of our lives. Engels said it's up to the working class not to allow that to happen. But once it's done, it's done. There's no going back, right? There's only moving forward. And it's hard to explain this, but it's just because something has happened that is bad. Once it happens, it doesn't mean that it's like we should wish that it never did. It's hard to explain. Like, it would be good, for instance, if Indigenous people and my family generations back weren't murdered and hunted. And, well, not my family wasn't hunted, but like the Beothic, or just lived through horrific poverty and all of these awful things. That would be great if that didn't happen. It would have been fantastic if a revolution had happened and none of that transpired. But it doesn't mean that because it happened, we should wish it away. Because
history is tragic. It's not a morality tale. And I think a lot of what we see in trying to somehow make the past right instead of making a better future is part of this sort of conservatism that's, I think, has infected a lot of the left.
Tell me more about that. So how's conservatism affected the left?
It's kind of hard to sort of pin it down, but I think it comes out of a sense of, because the historical project of the left was defeated and has been in crisis for so long, you can get into this sort of sense of pessimism and a kind of sort of resignation about what is possible to do. And that's kind of when you see, railing against sort of progress. I think even the idea of internationalism has even kind of, the left has a kind of weird sort of attitude towards internationalism. So yeah, that's how I see how that kind of conservatism has brooded.
So with this idea of Prometheus, how did Marx use it specifically, if you can, in his work?
It was more like a metaphor for the proletariat under capitalism, because I think there is a passage in Capital where he does use how the capital kind of is that chain on the proletariat and how it limits it. But also Prometheus in his work sort of represents, it's that kind of humanistic, striving for freedom against God and against sort of any kind of institutions and processes that kind of limit human freedom. And that's kind of what the striving ethic of socialism is freedom, to realize freedom, to realize the potential for freedom that lay within, modern society.
I've been doing a Grundrisse reading group with our Sublation subscribers, and I was talking about the sort of dialectic of man and God, which fits in with the sort of Promethean idea as well. So in the beginning, God creates man in his own image, right? And then you have this sort of, the next step, I suppose, in the dialectic is we think, oh, actually, no, man created God in his own image. But then the next step, which we've not been able to realize, is a potential for man to become God. This separation of man from his godly self over time. You know, in some ways it always was man, but it also wasn't, because we don't really have the ability to be gods, to like think and create with no separation the way that a god can. But even the Greeks couldn't even imagine this sort of full power over everything, this omnipotence. Even the gods were subject to fate. And now we can imagine a world in which, for better or for worse, all human beings can sort of create the world and think and create. I was talking about this, and you'll probably anticipate the issue here. And one of the people in the reading group said, well, couldn't the end of the dialectic be just as easily, there is no man? It's not like there is no God or man is God, but can man not negate himself? Isn't that kind of where we are now? That rather than realizing our godly selves, we destroyed the idea of any kind of godliness at all.
What do you mean?
Instead of going higher toward becoming gods, we went down and became animals or nothing even.
Yes, I can see that. I think I think if there is this process of social decay and, you know, immiseration and proletarianization that happens as well within capitalism, alongside the progress that humans can sort of, if you will, regress back into sheer animal existence. And like, especially since with capitalism, with every technological advance, there is always a jeopardy. Like, take nuclear. With nuclear power, you can light up entire cities, yet you can destroy them like that. Knowing the connection between capitalism with crisis and war and all that stuff, the jeopardy with that is even greater. So like, if you will, there was a world war now, it could be a nuclear one, and that would literally regress humans back into sheer animal existence of having to, if you will, rebuild civilizations, like turn civilization into a Fallout video game where you use bottle caps as currencies, and you set up, like, you know, differing kind of gangs to over territory to start accumulation and all that stuff. So humanity will have to start all over again.
Do you know, I feel like that's possible. I feel like that's a lot more likely than us sort of stealing fire from the gods and using it for good.
Yeah, but that's the jeopardy. Both scenarios are very possible, and that's why, you know, Marxism is not about the inevitability of socialism. It doesn't believe that. It's all like socialism has to be consciously arrived at and directed. Like, the proletariat has to consciously take a hold of history and divert it to a new social form.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How optimistic are you about that possibility?
Well, short term, I'm not optimistic. Obviously, you can only start being optimistic if you start from somewhere. You know, I think the project for socialism as a political project will take decades. So in terms of organizing and the working class sort of making people aware of social reality and, you know, trying to form a political movement. But then, you know, and this is where I will differ with, say, someone like Ben Burgess or Matt McManus, who I jokingly call Rolsey and Jacobins, who sort of want to take a shortcut and think you can get to socialism via the Democratic Party in the US. And I think that's no, that's the graveyard if you're going to try to do that. So, yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm in the sense that I think the possibility for, abundance, for freedom is always there, even now within capitalism. Like capitalism capitalist society expresses a potential that is distorted, scrambled, even on appearance very inhuman, but does express a potential for a global society based on abundance and freedom to arise. And it's up to us to realize that potential.
We talked to Chris Cutrone recently about this topic, and he said the exact same thing that you did, which is building a socialist movement is going to take a long time. And one of the comments that was sort of left on our sort of YouTube video was, we don't have time. And, I know that there's this like blackmail where it's like, don't think, there's no time to think. We just have to act now. And even, I'm sympathetic to that argument, but at the same time, we just talked about the real possibility of nuclear war. Is it the case that we can kind of sit back and, this is going to take decades? And the other thing is the idea of we have to go in and sort of teach people things seems to me to be going down into that technocratic territory where it's like, if only the people had the proper consciousness that we intellectuals do, then we would be able to avert disaster. I mean, how do we avoid the overlaps between these people that we don't like, who have constructed a new kind of subjectivity that they think is just natural and a true reflection of human beings, which is that it is weak and it requires people to go in and fix them? How do we avoid reproducing that as socialists? So one, do we have time? And two, do we really need to be teachers?
Yes, we have time. We can always extend that time, like nuclear war is not inevitable. And obviously that things, even under capitalism, progress is possible. It's not gonna, like I always say, nothing is inevitable. So, and it's always like down to human action whether these things happen or not. As for what's the second question about raising consciousness, the working class people are not stupid. They live the reality of capitalism every day. They live it. And but at the same time, that you do need a bit of clarification. Like they may know why capitalism is problematic and why things are bad, but they may not know why it is. There's nothing wrong with education. It's just there's a difference between education and brainwashing, And obviously, socialists shouldn't be in the business of brainwashing people or like trying to build up, drones. But nonetheless, nonetheless, we understand that working class people, like everyone else, has the capacity to reason and to understand. And there's nothing wrong with trying to appeal to that reason and understanding and trying to have the argument over it, because whether we like it or not, we are the minority in terms of us, Marxist sort of intellectual types. We are the minority, and you have to start from somewhere. Are you willing to have that argument or not? Are you willing to engage in that battle of ideas or not?
Yes. And I think that's the key, is to engage in a battle of ideas as fundamentally equals, as human beings who are equally trying to come to grips with the problems of our times, like what to do about things, to understand problems and figure out how to solve them. And that we are all, what makes me sort of bristle or kind of start thinking this doesn't sound right is when it's like, we need to go in and educate, and the picture that I get in my mind is like libs of TikTok where someone's like, screaming at these people, like, mouth wide open, angry face. I was like, we want to avoid that. I don't know what I want to do, but I don't want to do that. And I just to give kind of an example. So, and it also kind of assumes that the left has all the answers, which they fucking don't. I think that I have figured some things out, but I very much recognize, no, I don't think I've figured anything out. There are very few things that I am certain about that I couldn't be convinced otherwise on, I think. Or they're like, my thought is always developing, always, always, always. The idea that it would just stop is crazy. But just to give an example, during the sort of truckers protests, I was talking to my aunt, my brother every day, who were there all day long. And I was arguing with my brother, but in a really, I don't know, whenever I argue with people, I do try not to ever be personal, especially with my own family. But so we were having it out, arguing about things, and he was trying to bring me over to his side and convince me that this is how we should understand the situation. This is what's happening. I was trying to bring him on the other side, and he was using my data to explain things, and I was using his data to explain things. And eventually, I learned a humongous amount of things that were about that situation that I didn't understand before. And my brother, who thought that all communists were a bunch of crazy people who were screaming at him all the time about his language and such, sort of purity police, learned that that is not necessarily the case. And that while I was at the time a blue-haired intellectual, I did not share those views. And anyway, so we were arguing and talking, and then he starts, I was reading some of the stuff that he sent me, and he was reading stuff that I sent him. I sent him Oscar Wilde's Soul of Man Under Socialism, which he really liked. And then one day he comes to me and he says, I was watching a documentary about the former Soviet Union, and they did all these interviews with people. And I just thought it was interesting that not a single one of them said that now it's better. And this was somebody who started out like thinking he was an anti-socialist and an anti-communist. And I'm not saying the Soviet Union was great or anything and that we should but I just thought that it's just a massive kind of trajectory for somebody to go on who starts out thinking they might be right-wing because they don't like this sort of the perception of the left that gets sort of bandied about on the internet and the culture wars. And then is curious enough to see what really existing socialism was like. And to say, oh, that doesn't sound so bad. Not saying that, again, that the USSR is a great thing, but just anyway. But that's the kind of what I have in mind, and that it's about learning from people. And I just think some of the very best intellectuals were like autodidacts, working class autodidacts. There's like stories of, people say, oh, well, the working class doesn't need to read Capital. Certainly. But there were lots of like reading groups in warehouses and stuff where people were reading Capital.
There's this book called by Jonathan Rose on the sort of something called the work about the English working class. It's about autodidacticism in the English working class during the 19th and 20th century, and there's a bit about what the reading list of what a Scottish mill worker would read as part of these sort of like reading groups and education groups. And some of what was on there would kind of embarrass an undergraduate today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And of course, like initially, a lot of socialists objected to state education, which was specifically an attempt to put down the forms of education that working class people had organized for their own children. which they saw as dangerous. So it's not like people without our careful guidance are not intellectual and are not curious about the world and don't want to find the answers in the same way that we have through the course of our lives wanted to find the answers. Mm-hmm. And also, like, I feel like creating this divide, I feel like it's from the pressure of the left and online left that I create this divide, because now I teach in a university. But I am from that, I am from I come from those kinds of difficulties. And what made me interested in this wasn't because I went to university and learned about Marx. In fact, what I learned about so-called Marxism in university was like cultural critique and anti-consumerism and stuff like that. That's what I learned. I was shocked to learn when I actually read Marx in the original, instead of reading it via the Frankfurt School or my sociology textbooks, how based he was, how incredibly optimistic it was. And I had never heard that kind of optimism in my life, ever. What had come to me as like progressive and as a good person was, you should be a pessimist. You should be suspicious of humanity and the masses, and that would make you good and different. And when I actually read Marx's work, I was shocked.
Yes, I found the same reaction. Especially when I first read the Communist Manifesto, two things struck out to me. The beginning bit where he's like praising the bourgeoisie, and like that didn't quite make sense. It's like, why are you praising these people when you are supposed to be like ultra critical of them? And then the second bit where he criticizes the socialists, the true socialists, feudal socialists, reactionary socialists. That made me kind of, was like, that to me was actually the most interesting bit about it. It's like, why is he criticizing these people and for what reason? Like, and then that's when I sort of, when you read into it and you see why he had those views, it put Marxism in a very different light than what I originally saw it as, which, because a lot of kind of colloquially, Marxism was just like anti-capitalism. That's it. It's like bourgeoisie are evil. The bourgeoisie are evil. Capitalism's evil. Capitalism's bad. Individualism is bad. Consumerism is bad. Capitalism makes us greedy. Blah blah blah. Capitalism destroys the environment. Yada yada yada. But then when you read Marx, you find a more nuanced, actually, view of capitalism. That it is a dialectic between progression and regression, and both are true at the same time. And that capitalism is the most revolutionary system that humanity has seen so far, but what makes it so revolutionary is what's also bad about it. And what's bad about it is also what's kind of good about it. And to a lot of people a lot of people struggle with that. How can you have those two thoughts in you at the same time? And a lot of people struggle with that because they want to talk about this in a very sort of simplistic, one way or the other, good versus evil. And history is just not like that.
Yeah, there's. I had a conversation recently with someone who considered themselves like an anti-Marxist, anti-communist type, and he was saying, "Oh yeah, you can find if you go to read Capital, you can find it's so contradictory. Just he says one thing at one point, and he says the opposite at another point." Yeah. It's like, yeah, when you want to read a text without ever actually reading a text, you just go in and looking for that kind of stuff.
And what also kind of interested me more was the relationship between Marxism and the Enlightenment, because I've seen over the recent years this debate about what the relationship between Marxism and liberalism is, and there are two positions which I think are kind of wrong. One is just like, well, liberalism's bad, so Marxism hates liberalism, blah blah blah, which sort of, and kind of sees kind of liberalism as kind of just, well, a kind of ideology, false consciousness of the bourgeoisie to kind of rationalize its class rule, etc., etc. And even though it so weirdly assumes that Marxism just came out of a vacuum.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
While, the other side, which is where kind of Matt McManus kind of falls on, which is kind of implies that, Marxism is kind of liberalism plus this, etc., plus, and then, democratic socialism is basically Marxism plus John Rawls, and I think that's kind of wrong, because that's kind of just saying, because it's kind of like the criticism of bourgeois socialism, which is that one just merely affirms the slogans of the French Revolution, and that's how you deal with it. When Marxism is a kind of dialectical critique of the Enlightenment itself, in that it sort of takes up what Hegel and Kant and Rousseau do, and uses the tools of the Enlightenment itself to critique it, bourgeois society and bourgeois ideology, if you will. For example, human nature. Bourgeois ideology, from Machiavelli to Rousseau, has a very essentialist view of human nature, whether it is, man is wicked, corrupt, therefore you need a Leviathan to keep him in line, or Rousseau, man is, free, but is made, man is born free, but is forever in chains. But Marxism has a more, I think, dynamic view of human nature, that humans are historical beings. So what makes up our human nature changes with history and with the social forms, and it's a dialectical process that how we act upon the world, how we act upon nature, changes that nature, changes the world, but that also changes our own humanity, our own human nature, and thus human nature sort of expands with time. And that's one difference between Marxism and liberalism, I think. And that's where that dialectical critique of the Enlightenment and liberalism comes in. So
yeah, and then of course the fact that liberalism can't help but to negate itself eventually, which became clear obviously in the 1840s, and was, if it wasn't clear then, it was clear by 1853. Or was it 1851 when Marx made that famous speech in English to working men, when he was talking about how he'd come to this realization long before, really, when he became a communist, that that liberal values could not be realized, and moreover they would be negated, because he watched as soon as there was an attempt to kind of rise up, everybody abandoned their liberal values in favor of repression.
Yeah, and a good one of Marx's, I think, best text on this is The Holy Family, which is, and there's a chapter in it where he directly engages with like Enlightenment thinkers and sort of talks about how sort of critiques bourgeois materialism as being one-sided and not complete. And because he also sort of says that, the materialism of the French Enlightenment, if you take it logically, leads to socialism. So that's I think is a good bit on the relationship between Marxism and the Enlightenment.
That, and you can say similar things about individualism as well. That Engels famously excitedly wrote a letter to Marx when he came across Max Stirner's egoism, that the true egoist would become a communist of necessity. That if you truly wanted to sort of liberate the individual, then you would have to become a communist, because capitalism produces more, you are freer to become an individual within capitalism because of an advanced division of production. So everything is split into all these different parts, and all of a sudden you are no longer, as a woman now, you don't just sit around and like pound millet for 8 hours a day in the vast majority of cases around the world. And this leaves you free then to become something else, or many different things. And the more that production is socialized, as is happening under capitalism, the more you are free to be an individual. But we're not there yet. We are still, that we're in this sort of middle period, I suppose you could say, where we are appendages of the machine and feel alienated from this creativity. But it's still the case that through that alienation, you have the potential for a sublation, a return, or not a return, in a higher form, obviously, not going back, but you have this ability to realize being an individual in a fully formed way.
And there's a, if you will, socialized individualism, in the sense that there isn't this dichotomy between individualism or individual freedom and the freedom of the collective kind of is abolished. Because one of the things about capitalism is it creates individuals, but also socialized society itself, that it creates a form of a way that it creates the social infrastructure, if you will, for individualism to potentially flourish. Mm-hmm. That human beings will be like, socialized individuals, if you will.
You only become an individual in the context of society, and we become paradoxically even more so individual. We're individual enough without society that we will just starve, because we have no capacity to create to reproduce our own existence outside of the social, the way that it is produced in our society. You can't, even if you wanted to have like a garden, you still have to buy the land. There's nothing outside of it. And so this creates a situation where you are so, ironically, so dependent on society as an individual that you can't even go out and pick an apple. So this is a sort of contradiction where we become even more individuals, but also more dependent on society. But you mentioned before that the subject kind of changes and unfolds, obviously, as a historical outgrowth of history in different social forms. And you said it expands. But this seems to me to be teleological, because what's happening now within our societies is a destruction of the subject, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. And the subject doesn't seem to be expanding, but collapsing.
Yeah.
So how do we explain that?
Well, this is, I suppose, another difference between Marxism and liberalism, is that liberalism views progress in a kind of more linear fashion, whereas Marxism opens the possibility that social regression is possible. And that's what we've seen, a kind of deep kind of social and philosophical regression, in the sense that people's subjectivities is narrowed. How we experience history itself is very truncated. That history is treated as like a dumpster for references and signifiers and facts, but isn't sort of seen as having any meaning or purpose or sort of direction. In this sense, we really do live in postmodern times, in the sense that we still live in modernity, but without the telos of communist revolution that did give modernity meaning. That what Marxism gave history meaning, in the sense that human beings, men and women, were participants in this great historical drama, and they were the protagonists, and they had, the capacity to change the way this story ends, or how, change the way the story unfolds. And because we've had this sort of experienced so much defeat, crisis, and, social regression, that sense of history has sort of been lost and disintegrated. So history is just seen as something that just happens to you, almost fatalistic, deterministic, and that our capacity to change how it goes, it's sort of been depreciated.
So is it that the idea of our liberal subject, is it the liberal subject as an idea that is dead, or is it really dead?
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.